Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So today we're going to go over the big ideas in economics. So I want to kick this off. This is almost the microeconomics in one lesson here. So our 10 big ideas are incentives, cost, markets, prices, comparative advantage, division of labor, cooperation, externalities, public choice, and then what it is that governments can do. So our first big idea is that incentives matter. Incentives drive behavior. There's lots and lots of examples of this. Of course, one of the principal ones as a parent is you think about the incentives that you give your kids. So I have several small children. They make a big mess of their room just about every day. My wife and I send them in the room and say, pick up your room. If we just send them in the room and say, pick up your room, more or less nothing gets done. They go and play with their toys and have fun, as kids are wont to do. However, if I say, go pick up your room, I'm going to come in an hour and I'm going to confiscate the toys that you haven't picked up, they tend to do much better. Why is that? I've given them incentives. As a professor, another set of incentives we think about are grades. So as an economics professor, I think about this very carefully. If it's something that I care about, one of the things I want to do is incentivize students to focus on a particular exam or subject matter, etc. I attach grades to it. That's an incentive for students to focus on that. Another good example of this is what we call the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is an idea when there's a common resource, so something like fish in the sea or a pasture that anyone in a city can graze their cattle on, are sort of classic examples of the tragedy of the commons. In this case, no one has incentive to preserve the property or the fish in the sea. They will just take as much as benefits them in the short run. There's no long-term incentive to maintain the material. One of the interesting stories related to incentives is related to the war on drugs. There was a time, I believe in California, when they made it actually a capital offense to be caught with a certain amount of these very hard drugs. And it seems like a good idea because you have these incentives. You're trying to disincentivize trading in drugs. But the problem was, what happened was when law enforcement officers went to arrest these people that were suspected of, and in this case actually did, traffic in this amount of drugs, the incentive to not be captured became very, very high. Whereas before, a drug trafficker, they didn't want to be captured, but killing a police officer would put them up for capital crimes. Now having the drugs was a capital crime, and so there was much more incentive to actually fight back. This got many law enforcement officers killed in the war on drugs, especially in California. Russ Roberts tells a story about prisoner transport. So many prisoners were transported to Australia. Many of you have probably heard this story, so I won't recount it. But there was a time when many of the prisoners would die in transport. And one of the solutions, and eventually the most effective solution, was to literally pay the captains of the ship per safely transported prisoner. At the beginning, before the incentives were aligned, as many as 30% of prisoners would die, and often a quarter, a full 25% of prisoners would pass away in transport. It's a long trip, and ship conditions are rough even in these fairly modern times. It ended up that by incentivizing, and I forget the exact numbers, by incentivizing the safe transport of the prisoners, it essentially fell to zero, and all the prisoners were safely transported to Australia. In economics, the most important application of incentives are prices. So what happened here is that our prices convey information, and I'm going to say this over and over throughout this class. And what we're going to see is that the reaction to these prices are what's going to adjudicate in incentives in this case. Now, incentives come in many ways. In economics, we're obviously going to focus on a lot of prices, but incentives can be more than just money. They can be things like honor, or they can even be things like guilt. There's many examples of this, right? It's not just money, not even just material things. There are many things that incentivize human behavior, okay? And in fact, this is the bedrock principle of economics, and you're going to see it woven throughout the class. Our next idea is cost. And in fact, one of the most important things we're going to do is to understand cost. And the first step towards understanding cost is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost, by definition, is the highest valued alternative, highest alternative use of your time, for example. So if you're sitting watching this video, you could instead be doing something else. Whatever that other thing is, taking a nap, calling your mother, eating some dinner, any of those things could be opportunity cost, whichever one you would be doing if you weren't doing this. So I've put this funny little acronym in here. This is, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Economists are saying there's no such thing, are fond of saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. And what we mean by that is, even if I offered to buy you lunch tomorrow, I said, come up to campus, we'll go over, we'll get some Chick-fil-A. That lunch would be free in a sense, i.e. you wouldn't pay for it. But you could do something else with your time. That's an opportunity cost. One of the biggest ideas that I'm going to advance in this class is that all cost is opportunity cost. All cost is opportunity cost. And that's a much broader, when we often think about cost, we limit ourselves to thinking about financial or monetary cost, what it cost me to purchase something. And that is an opportunity cost because that money could be spent in another way, right? But there's time and there's many other types of costs. We're going to talk a lot about transaction costs later on in this class. Alfred Marshall is fond of saying economics is the study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. And that is, at the end of the day, the most fundamental way to think about opportunity cost. So opportunity cost then is what must be given up to get something. And that's intentionally broad, right? Not just money, not just time. Anything that we're thinking about in terms of cost is opportunity cost. Milton Friedman is known to say economics can basically sum down to two principles. One is that demand slopes downward, that incentive structure that we talked about a minute ago. So by sloping downward in this case, we mean the more something costs, the more you have to want it to be able to purchase it, and that nothing is free, which is opportunity cost. So take these two ideas, incentives matter and opportunity cost, and you have an excellent foundation for building the rest of economics. Our third idea is markets, and specifically how they work, right? So the way to understand this is that there's this idea called emergent order. Many things, let's think of some broad categories, right? Weather is not a human action, right? It's a naturally occurring phenomenon. Neither is it of human design, right? It came to us the way that it is. Let's think of sports, right? One of my other classes that I love to teach, sports economics. Shameless plug, if you get an opportunity and you need an upper level economics elective, come take sports economics from me. We'll have a lot of fun. Sport is human action. Pretty straightforward, right? You go and you organize the game and you play it. But sport is also of human design, right? So we lay out the rules, we set up the game, we make all the materials, components, etc. It's entirely of human design. Some things, though, are of human action, but not of human design, which is to say things like language are obviously created by people, but nobody designed language. It's emergent. It is naturally evolving. Other examples of this would be culture, traffic, and most importantly, markets. We don't step back from markets and design them. They naturally occur. You don't even have to say, let's have a market, right? The natural exchange between you and I makes a market. I'm going to talk more about bread in New York City here in just a minute because I want to talk about coordination and cooperation, as I've already teased. But the lesson here is that markets are emergent. They're decentralized, right? There's no central organization of it. So what's the central organization of sport? The leagues, right? Whether that's NCAA, MLB, NFL, many different organizations that centralize sport, right? But language has no centralization, right? And in fact, if we go into different areas of nations that are all one continuous nation, you'll see different applications of language. I'm here in Texas. We like to use words like y'all, and in fact, I intentionally keep that word in my lexicon, right? But if I go to Boston and I say y'all, it's going to cause me to stand out as not being native to that area, even though we're speaking the same English, modern American English. Okay, emergent order through markets leads to an incentive structure. That is to say, it gives prices, and that's how allocation happens. So allocation of resources, production, services, all of that happens emergently. What I mean by emergent, just in case that's not a word that you're familiar with, is that this is something that spontaneously happens. Economists also call this spontaneous order. So emergent or spontaneous order. How it is that prices emerge is one of the most important things that we can learn in economics. And obviously they come from markets. But you've probably never stopped and asked yourself, why is it that we observe different prices? And of course, someone who's not taken an econ class, they have an instinctual response. Sellers set prices, right? But they don't do so in a vacuum. They don't actually control prices. One of the best ways to observe this is through the sale of houses. So you can ask for any price when you offer your house for sale, right? You can say, I want to get $500,000 for this house. And at the end of the day, you only have to get one consumer, one home buyer, to agree to that price, right? But prices serve a very important purpose of conveying the value that you place on a good that you're selling and allowing a potential consumer to compare that price to their alternative options. Remember, this goes back to opportunity cost. So what happens is you set a price and you say, well, other houses of similar size and age and features of the home, maybe they only go for $300,000. But I have a special feature of the house, right? My wife is a carpenter. She built a very nice deck with pergola. We have a beautiful little setup in our backyard, right? And perhaps we say, well, that's got to be worth at least $100,000. Now, hopefully, most of you are shaking your head. There's no way that a 200 square foot deck and a pergola adds $100,000 onto your home. But my wife and I are convinced we can set whatever price we want, right? And this applies to any seller. But in this example, we can set any price that we want. But what's the problem with that? Suppose we find somebody who loves the deck, the pergola, the neighborhood, everything great, right? But now they have an opportunity cost. They have a choice to face. They have a set of incentives. Money that they put into this house is money that can't go elsewhere, right? So even if they love that, they may not love it $200,000 more than an alternative or $100,000 more than an alternative. So they say, yeah, we love the pergola, we love the deck, but we can get a house that's pretty similar to this, similar neighborhood, size, age of home, all those factors for just a little bit less, or maybe for a lot less, and we only love it a little bit less. So it's that function that prices serve that's so critical. And prices do this by adjusting. And we're going to develop that model of how prices emerge from markets through what we call supply and demand. I'm going to call this the workhorse model in economics. So demand is the willingness to pay, depending on the alternatives. That's what we just discussed. And of course, supply is the willingness to accept, depending on the alternatives, which of course is very naturally tied in to cost. Okay, so prices are emergent, right? And what I mean by that is we don't design any particular price, but those natural pressures, my house has been on the market for a year now and I haven't had a sale, will naturally cause me to lower that price. No one told me that. Right? No one designed a market to convey information to me that I have my house priced too highly, right? And in fact, the process is even messy. But the consequence is that it establishes the availability of various goods and services. This is where a phrase like anything's available for a price, right? Like you could say, well, you have a good job and you're happy in your job, and I have a job that you're not really going to enjoy doing, but I can get you to do it if I pay you the right amount. Now, for the most part, in that sense, anything is available for a price. And again, those prices don't necessarily have to be monetary. Our next idea is comparative advantage. But let me start by defining absolute advantage. So absolute advantage is simply producing more with the same set of resources. A good way to think about this is the individual productivity of workers. So if I give my son, who's the oldest of my children, if I give him a stack of papers and a pair of scissors and I say cut out a bunch of stars, right? Shapes. And then I give it to my daughter as well. She's a little bit younger. My son probably has an absolute advantage. He's a little older. He's a little more dexterous, right? He might be a little more efficient with how much of the paper he wastes in the process, so on, right? Same with any job that we have out there. It simply means producing more. Comparative advantage, though, is a slightly different thing. So this is discovered by economist David Ricardo. And Ricardo discovered what actually happens in a situation where we're comparing the potential productivity of people is that opportunity cost plays a huge role. So if I am a particularly talented fisherman, but I also need to build houses. Right? Simple example, we're going to see more of this later on in this class, but think about maybe living on a deserted island, right? You got to have shelter, you got to have something to eat, right? And perhaps I'm stranded on a desert island with you, and you're a better fisher and you're a better carpenter, right? But you're a really good fisher and an okay carpenter, and I'm just bad at both, or not as good as you at both, right? The comparative advantage in this case is that any time you spend making houses is time you don't spend fishing, right? So me focusing, and that's this idea of specialization in a second. Any time you spend focusing on building the houses is time you're not spending fishing. That's a very high opportunity cost because you're really good at fishing. Time spent fishing has a opportunity cost of building houses. Now, if I'm sort of similarly mediocre at both, my opportunity cost for building houses is pretty low because I'm not a particularly good fisher, right? We can engage in a strategy of specializing in those things. But in order to do that, and that specialization leads us to this idea called division of labor. Division of labor is extraordinarily important to any economy of any size, right? Even the simple economy that we're going to discuss of just the two of us on a desert island, right? Division of labor means we split up the task that we're doing so that we might specialize, right? And it gives us an important insight into what it is that's truly miraculous about trade. So comparative advantage says, even if you're not strictly better than someone in a vacuum, in a head-to-head comparison, you don't have the absolute advantage. If your opportunity cost of doing that is lower, you have a comparative advantage in that thing. Now, obviously, if you're good at fishing and poor at making houses, and I'm good at making houses and poor at fishing, then the opportunity cost and the absolute advantage and the comparative advantage, they all align, right? And that is probably what we see in reality. But remember, markets, and indeed, I would argue all of society, right? Language, culture, markets, economy, all that is emergent, right? How is it that those things emerge? Well, they emerge on the basis of comparative advantage, right? I focus on being an economics professor so that my friend can focus on being a farmer. My pastor can focus on being a pastor. You guys can focus on being accountants and marketing experts and business owners and proprietors, hopefully all those things that you're coming through this class in order to be able to get to. That is to say, we specialize. And by specializing here, we get to what is just about the only free lunch. I already said a minute ago there's no such thing as free lunch. But this is the miracle of trade. I'll say maybe it's close to free lunch here. And the reason for that is by just rearranging how it is that we spend our time, we can get more out of the same amount of resources, right? So instead of you spending half a day fishing and half a day building houses and I spend half a day building houses and half a day fishing. I can focus on building houses more. So you can focus on fishing more, and you can get better at that, do more of it, and then I'll trade you some time spent working on your house in exchange for fish. I don't have to do any fishing. You don't have to do any house building. We end up with more fish and more houses in this case. That's division of labor. Now, this ties into an idea of cooperation, or really what I like to call coordination. So we can see immediately, sort of off the cuff, if you will, that some things are winners and losers. Economists like to use the example of broken windows. So if you're walking by a construction site, and you've seen where maybe a small child has had some fun throwing rocks through windows on a construction site, right? You see all those broken windows, and it's apparent to you that somebody's going to benefit from that, right? Because somebody is going to have to make those windows and install those windows. But somebody's losing as well, right? The owner or the firm doing the construction. They're going to have to pay for that. There's obvious winners and losers, right? And yet, sometimes economic activity, I shouldn't say sometimes, it is always the case that economic activity is beneficial to all the actors involved, which is why I want to point to you a miracle. And it doesn't have to be New York City. We can think of any example. But think about the provision of the goods. Let's think about New York City in this case, but you can generalize it to your city as well. How is it that every morning people wake up in one of the biggest cities in the world, on one of the smallest landmasses, one of the most dense places on earth, and they're never out of bread? The answer is coordination. And if I ask you to describe the process by which bread ends up in New York, gives people virtually unlimited options for when, where, and how they get it, and there's never any planning in that, right? I wake up in the morning, I see I'm out of bread, I go to the grocery store. Happens just the same virtually everywhere in the world. There's some coordination going on, right? There's a shop owner who is selling the bread. There's somebody making the bread. There's somebody transporting the bread. There's somebody thinking about all the different steps in it. You couldn't describe the process, right? Not only could you not do it as one individual person, you couldn't even describe the process, right? This is true wealth, that you don't have to stock up on bread to make it through a year. In fact, wealth is made in the economic processes that we have today through the use of free markets, free economic activity that give us coordination, and that truly fundamentally is the wealth that we have access to. That's why even you and I, probably middle to lower income people, are some of the richest people to ever live. It has nothing to do with you or me. It has to do with the fact that there's an emergent order and free markets. People are allowed to engage in cooperation and coordination. And just by going through and doing the best that we can for ourselves, we enrich everyone around us. This is an idea Adam Smith called the invisible hand. Let me say one last thing then about cooperation and coordination. How is it that you can get on a plane, do many other things, and never know the pilot's name? I've flown quite a few times. Wouldn't say a lot. Probably know people that have flown quite a bit more than me. But I've flown plenty. I have never once known the pilot's name. I think maybe sometimes they come on the intercom and introduce themselves or something like this, right? But I've never known the pilot, right? How can it be that you'd allow a stranger to take you 10,000 feet in the air or more, 30,000 feet in the air, and fly 400 miles an hour in a giant death tube, and you don't even blink? It's just what you do. The answer is there are incentives in play that incentivize them to establish a track record of safety and speed and convenience and amenities of a plane, a business, pilots. Everybody's finding their own way. It's not that the pilot woke up in the morning and thought, I could benefit the most people in the world by being a pilot. It's not, right? He or she woke up that morning and thought, I want to feed my family. I want to take care of my kids. I don't have some money to spend on the weekends. And to do that, what I have to do is be a good pilot who can fly people safely. And that's how virtually every job is. Now, to this point, I've essentially established all the basic fundamentals of what a microeconomics class, and again, all that material that we talked about in the introduction video to this course have established. Now, there are a couple things, and to be honest, if we just got those first 7 ideas, you'd have done a great job in the class, picking up what it is that we can learn about economics, microeconomics, and of course, praxeology that we've talked about before. But we also want to make room for some more advanced ideas. And I hate to say advanced sometimes because it gives the impression that this is the really important stuff. It's really not. Those first 7 ideas are things that you're not going to meet anybody who knows, not going to meet anybody who thinks about them carefully. And if you do a good job understanding those things, you'll be a mile ahead of everyone. And in fact, in some ways, it's almost hesitation to include externalities for me in this ideas video, because it is something that people like to use to try to escape the first 7 ideas. And yet we need to have a good discussion and education about these. So an externality is a cost borne by a third party. So I like to smoke the occasional cigar. If I go buy a cigar from my cigar shop, that's the first 2 parties, right? I give the money, they give me a cigar, we're a party to a transaction. However, if I light up my cigar and I walk by you on the sidewalk and you get the smoke in your face and it causes your eyes to dry out, and you got to rub your eyes now. That's a cost to the transaction that's not borne by the party. Now, there are several types of externalities. They're sometimes even positive, right? So the classic example is like a shop, a bakery, and it bakes bread and then the smell goes out on the street. And you benefit from that, but they don't benefit from making that smell unless you buy it. So that's a positive externality. So there's positive externalities and there's negative externalities. So costs or benefits really borne by third parties. We tend to think of negative externalities. So we should note that. Negative externalities tied to cost, and positive ones tied to benefit. So more than one type of externality here. Now, there's a couple ways and forms that these externalities take place: public goods, asymmetric information, market power, which is monopoly, monopsony, natural monopoly. We'll talk about all these things as we go throughout the course. I'm not going to take the time to define them here. And it's important to understand that all of these come together to form the potential for what we call market failure. So market failure is when the miracle of economic exchange that's happening freely and openly doesn't get us to the most efficient or most perfect outcome, right? And what I want to point out is that externalities are an important first step towards understanding market failure. That is to say, externalities are necessary, but they're not sufficient. So you won't see market failure if you don't have some type of externality, but the fact that you see an externality doesn't necessarily mean that the market fails, right? Okay, so there's a very famous economics paper written by Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase says that your externalities can often merely be solved by property rights. I'm going to leave that for the externalities video that we're doing later on in this class, but I just want to sort of tease that idea that we gain, we do have some solutions for externalities. Okay, next I want to talk, these next 2 ideas tie together, and it's an economic way to think about politics. So I said in the introduction video, one of the reasons that I love economics so much is it's the most useful tool for thinking about human action. And one of the big ideas that we want to take from a from a microeconomic class is how to think about politicians' public choice. We call this public choice. So public choice is a simple idea, built on a simple idea, that decision makers, politicians, bureaucrats, anybody who's writing policy, they are also humans. Seems like an obvious observation, but that means they maximize their own well-being. So the thing that's powerful about a market is in order to maximize my well-being, I must make a set of choices that also benefit you, right? Because I have to induce you to make the trade with me, and trade is mutually beneficial. The problem, of course, with politicians, policymakers, bureaucrats, etc., that's not how their incentive structure works, right? They have the force of the government outside of a market on their side. And so many of the things that we observe in governance can't be understood if you don't think carefully about public choice. A good example of this. Why is it that the government always, its budget is bigger every year? Well, the answer is because decision makers maximize their own well-being, right? If I am the director of a government program, do I want to make my job smaller? Of course not, right? And some of that, it can even be quite, I'm not trying to paint these people, these are humans. I'm not trying to paint these as good or bad people. If you were in that job, if I were in that job, we would do exactly the same way. Economist James Buchanan boils down public choice to the idea that politicians respond to incentives. And if you're not careful, the default incentive, of course, is to grow your program, is to grow your size of the government. And those can have costs, real costs. Those obviously have costs because we put money and time and all types of resources, land, buildings, etc., into the government. And if we don't have an incentive that checks that cost increase, we're going to have problems. Well, principally, you're going to have high costs. So this brings us to an idea called bootleggers and Baptists. So this is a neat way to say anytime that you have a special interest-driven policy, you will have a surprising cross-section of people that support it. Okay, so bootleggers and Baptists refers to Prohibition. And in Prohibition, they outlawed the sale of alcohol. Well, I probably needn't spend much time defending to you why Baptists were for this, right? Baptists are religious. They think drinking is bad. No offense if you're listening and you're a Baptist. I know that's an oversimplification of your stance. But in general, you have a religious set of people that think, okay, we should outlaw alcohol. The puzzling part is, why would bootleggers, why would people who share nothing in common with the religious, why would they also support the policy? Well, the answer is, if something's illegal and you're illegally running it, is the slang in this case, but trafficking in it, you stand to benefit in this case if it remains illegal, where if you were already willing to engage in that kind of behavior, by the process becoming legal, you will face many more competitors who weren't willing to do it when it was illegal, but are now willing to do it when it was legal. So special interests and incentives often align, or always align. Okay, the final thing that I want to say, the last big idea, is to think about what is it that politicians can actually do. In America, and really probably the whole of human history since the Industrial Revolution anyways, there's this implicit assumption that the president or the government runs the economy. And the economy's success or failure reflects somehow on the president. One of the things that I would love to disabuse you of as you go through this class is this idea that the economy is somehow run by the president, regardless of which side of the political aisle that you come on. Your preferred candidate can't manipulate the economy. They can make policies that are better or worse for the economy, but the economy, I'm fond of saying this, the economy is much bigger and much stronger than the government. It doesn't seem like that because the government is both of human action and of human design, whereas the economy is of human action but not of human design. So we understandably feel like we can't control it as much. So I'm going to finish with a little story here. And it's the story of the boy and the pool, right? So you come up and you see a young boy, and he says, I've been pouring water into this pool all morning, and it hasn't changed. So, of course, you try to describe to the young boy. You say, well, you have a little bucket and pouring water, and you're probably not going to be able to observe much of the change, right? your bucket is relatively small compared to the size of the pool. It's a good answer. But you come back a week later, the next Saturday morning perhaps. You come across this child, and he's still standing there with the bucket. You say, "What are you doing? And didn't we have this conversation?" He said, "Yes, but all week I'm spending every waking hour pouring water into this pool." And you say, "Well, I don't understand. The bucket's pretty small and the pool's pretty big, but a week worth of work is a lot of work. Let me see your process." So the child goes to the other end of the pool and scoops water up with his bucket, walks around to the side that you always see him on, and pours it in. What's happened there, right? Politicians and governments are not creative forces, right? And rearranging resources by political processes to serve political means can't reach economic ends, right? Or at the very best, those would be extraordinarily small things. So anytime we evaluate policies, and both sides of the political spectrum have these kind of policies, the one that comes to mind right now would be something like education, right? For the most part, if we go to forgive debt to college students, that's just rearranging resources. Now, there might be other non-economic reasons we do or do not want to do that. But at the end of the day, that will have no economic effect. And any economist worth their salt is going to say this is just a transfer, right? We're moving college student debt onto the national budget in this case. And that's just moving the costs and the benefits around. It can't actually do anything broader in the economy. So there you go. We have it, the 10 big ideas and that are going to be woven throughout this class and really underlie all of economics. So I hope you'll take these 10 lessons to heart and keep them in your mind as we move throughout the class.